for staying with us. This is the third panel, so I know that some of you might be tired, but anyway, this is a very important panel. It's the fifth time we organize the gathering of the Tech Accord here in Davos with amazing experts. So today we're going to be focusing on the industrial leadership of IoT, which is a very big subject, especially as many devices are getting connected to the internet. So in the panel we have Alissa for another time with us. You were here in May last year together with Mark. And we also have another representative from Nokia who is coming. Alissa is from Cloudflare, VP and Global Head of Policy Cloudflare. And Mark is the President of Security on DX Technology, big experts on the subject of IoT. And in a few minutes, we will be joined by Nishant Batra, which is the Chief Strategy and Technology Officer of Nokia. So if you don't mind, if you want to talk, you maybe go somewhere else, because here the idea is to get focus on this subject, right? So I appreciate your cooperation to maintain as silent as possible. Oh, here you are. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Nice to see you again.
Hi.
Great. So Nishant is with us, Chief Strategy and Technology Officer of Nokia. So as I mentioned before, the Tech Accord is, actually this panel is going to be broadcast, it's being broadcast by YouTube. And we have a very interesting audience, as we got something like 700 people registered through the channel, so big audience. So as I say, tonight is the fourth Davos gathering of the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, which is being hosted by WISeKey on our Wednesday event. It is a focus this year on IoT. WISeKey obviously is an IoT company. We manufacture semiconductor microchips. And the IoT business is totally disrupting itself as more devices are getting connected. But more connections we have on devices, more we are increasing the cybersecurity risk for those devices and any other devices that connect to them. So today on the panel, we will discuss about those risks, how we mitigate them with the technology of the companies represented in the panel, and some views about what else needs to be done, both on the regulatory side, as IoT is not necessarily well regulated internationally. There is a movement to do so, but it's not still optimal, and see how this is expanding. So I will give, maybe just to introduce the speakers, just introduce yourself, what you do to the audience, and then we will move into the moderation. So maybe, Nishant, I'll give you the floor.
Good. Hello, everyone. My name is Nishant, and I'm the Chief Strategy and Technology Officer at Nokia. It's my first time at WEF, and it's pretty crazy out there, but hopefully we'll have a good discussion on security today. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishant.
Hi, I'm Alissa Starzak, and I am Vice President and Global Head of Public Policy at Cloudflare. And I am also excited to be here today. I have done this before on these panels, but I agree, it's crazy out there. But I'm looking forward to the conversation in here.
Hi everyone, I'm Mark Hughes. I'm the President of Security at DXC Technology. Been to Davos quite a few times, so used to the craziness and the snow, and last year as it was in May. So great to be here, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we're going to move for our first speaker with Nokia. And as you all know, Nokia is a leading network vendor. Nokia products and solutions are connecting more and more IoT devices to service provider and enterprise network. So how do you see IoT as a major impact on the security on the network? What are your views on that?
You know, let me start with, so we're of course in the business of connectivity, and it used to be about connecting for voice, then connecting for data, and now it's connecting IoT devices. And we see that between 2021 and 2025, the proliferation of IoT devices on networks will more than double. 2021, we had 14 billion IoT devices. It's expected to go beyond 30 billion by 25. So this is a big challenge that's coming up. Essentially, as the world moves towards 5G, faster networks, in parallel, the world moves towards industrial digitalization, we now start to increase the sensing, the IoT devices out there. This increases the threat surface significantly. And here, now we have to think about how do you counter this threat in terms of preparation. And there are several ways you can. The first recognition one has to have is that most users are not security champions. Yes. And these devices are often used and deployed by users which are not security experts. And then because the threat surface and the attack surface is pretty big, there are possibilities of several attacks. One example I'm sure my friends here can attest to, when the Mirai botnet happened, and that led to a DDoS attack. And this is a big risk out there. So one of the things that now we advocate, of course, we need to make sure the networks are secure. Let's not just make sure the endpoint is secure. We need to make sure there is end-to-end security when we're building IoT networks. It's very important. At Nokia, for example, in Dallas, we've launched the A-Star Lab. And this is exactly focused on ensuring that there is end-to-end security in these networks. And what that part is, we also need to make sure that the application deployers here, we have to make sure that the default security profiles are very good. There's policies that exist in terms of encryption. There are policies that exist in terms of access control. And we need to make sure there is a general security culture that needs to exist for us to counter this increased attack surface.
Thank you very much, Nishant. So we're going to move to Cloudflare, Alissa. And Cloudflare has a new initiative around zero trust and for consumer IoT space. Can you tell us about this and how it aligns with growing regulatory efforts to improve IoT device security?
Sure, and I just want to emphasize the point and make it even, and sort of kind of put that in context, that growth of IoT devices already right now, there are double the amount of IoT devices in the world that there are smartphones. And that growth, as you said, is just going to continue escalating because what happens from IoT is that every user has multiple IoT devices, and that is only growing. So that escalation that I think we're seeing, I completely agree. I think that's in our future, and we have to plan for it. I think I want to sort of point out the two problem sets, and then we can talk about our solution and then the current regulatory structure that's sort of proposed. Sure. So I think what we see on IoT are two different things. We see questions about the IoT device itself. So thinking about the security of something that might be in your home. And when you think about IoT, think about something like a connected camera. So now all of a sudden you have a video camera, it's connected to the internet. What happens if it's not secure? All of a sudden it's a risk to you that way, right? So that is on the user side of it. But the DDoS side of it is the other side. So you have an unsecured device, and now it can be used as part of an attack metric. So because no one's paying attention to it, because it's a cheap device, basically it can call out, what a botnet does is essentially it calls out to the internet, and lots of things calling out all at the same time can take a site down or can take something else down. That's actually what causes a botnet. So those are the two things that you have to think about that you can protect against. What Cloudflare has thought a lot about, Cloudflare is a network security provider, and we have a global network that we can connect to all over the world. So what we've been thinking about from a solution set are thinking about the controls you can do with a network. So imagine now you have a device whose only connection point, where you can put controls on how it connects, right? So the only connection point goes to the Cloudflare network, where you can then filter out both in and out where the traffic then it goes out to. So we actually proposed a product earlier this year that's based on a SIM, that's an IoT SIM, and the idea is that you can put the controls in the network space. So it doesn't have to be on the device itself, although, again, the more security, the better. The more you can have default security, incredibly important. All of those things, incredibly important. But the idea that you can add to the network space and think about it connecting that way and put controls in that way is just another way of thinking about it. And we've been talking about this a lot because I think we have to be really creative when we talk about security and IoT, because what you often have are cheap manufacturing. You have devices that people don't want to spend a lot of money on, so it's not the smartphones of the world that people are going to spend hundreds of dollars on. And so you have to anticipate what the potential risks would be and how you can mitigate against them. From a regulatory standpoint, I think one of the things that we're seeing we're seeing things like the Cyber Resilience Act out of the EU,
Yeah.
which is really thinking about labeling and the security piece, making it more visible to consumers. What we would like, I think, from that space, from the regulatory space, is really thinking comprehensively about lots of different solutions. So don't assume that one is always going to work. Think about the network solutions as well, layer them on top, is really kind of what we're looking at. There are also sort of new frameworks. So NIST has a new is really looking at sort of frameworks for IoT, thinking about standards, and we think those pieces are important too.
Thank you very much, Alissa. So we move to Mark. Mark is on DXC technology. You do a lot of work to maintain and integrate IoT solutions for large organizations in the context. What kind of work do you do to ensure that IoT security posture is prioritized compared to traditional security space?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first things first, when we get to the 30 billion devices that are going to be out there, they're not all the same. And I know that might sound a bit obvious, but there are characteristics of IoT devices that in some cases look quite similar to and have characteristically processing power and interfaces like human interfaces, almost a bit like smartphones or endpoints, all the way down to very basic sensors that exist on a network, but they have no interface that you would be able to interact with as a human, maybe have an API interface or just a network interface. And let's not forget that some of those very basic sensors aren't just necessarily sensors. They're also potentially actuating devices as well, where you have this curious mix of something very basic, actually controlling things physically. Think about, I don't know, ovens and temperature controllers and the like. So things that can have really quite significant problematic impacts if they are used in the wrong way. So I think the first thing is to think about IoT things as really quite a very broad spectrum. And therefore you have to think about them quite differently and bucket them as far as possible. I'll come back to that. But think about this, the device itself. We have to think about the device security. Alissa and Nitesh have already spoken about what we can do with regulation to help actually bake in some of what I describe as pre-market things that need to be there to make the device in itself more capable from a security point of view to start with. Secondly, you then have the actual data and how data is potentially extracted and managed on that device. Is it characteristically a device that perhaps has storage? Not all IoT devices do, but if they do, that then comes with the requirement to ensure how you manage that and manage the data that's on the device itself. And then lastly, the privacy implications. Now, we see this a lot in security. How do you deal with a risk that is incredibly disaggregated? Think 30 billion devices. And the power of IoT is often, in a lot of these sensors, is when you bring that data together, and then the data itself becomes very valuable. So a number of different aspects. We talked about Mirai and how IoT devices can be used as it was in 2016 in the DIN DNS attack, and subsequently with, we've seen other threat actors utilizing similar type of bot environments. But think also about when data from all of these sensors is aggregated, the value of that data and the privacy implications of looking after that. So a whole spectrum of considerations. So now quickly coming back to, therefore, the strategies that we employ with our customers when they are heavily invested in IoT estates. So first things first, think about the characteristic of the devices that you're deploying. If it's a camera, it will be more sophisticated, probably with a human interface, rather than perhaps a sensor in an agricultural context, which may simply be there just to do a temperature type of sensing a piece of work. And let's not forget that type of device needs to be very, very power conservative to give it the longevity as they are deployed in the environments, the harsh environments which they work in. So think about the risks associated with those different types of devices and therefore tailor the strategy towards that. And the strategy really that we employ with our customers is embrace zero trust as much as possible from the outset. Zero trust has now matured to a point where you can really group these devices and put them into an environment, a network-based environment where you're still reliant on, perhaps we don't talk so much about this any longer, but it's still very, very relevant, utilizing network compartmentalization and network traffic to control characteristically the flows in and out, but also to spot where there may be vulnerabilities that need to be dealt with in the IoT environment. So that's a really important strategy of getting the network configuration and also creating things like IoT network gateways, which I know organizations like Nokia and others do as well, which is really important in how you then deploy and compartmentalize the devices. But then when you have aggregated that and you control it through that zero trust approach, is then what we advise our clients is to really make sure that you're then monitoring that and looking out, where possible, for known vulnerabilities, not just in the devices themselves, but to how threat actors are exploiting IoT more broadly. So keeping your antenna up, employing those strategies, continually assessing how that works and how you manage the risk within those environments, and then obviously mitigating the risk comprehensively. I'm afraid it does come down to being quite busy and being quite nuanced in how you have to do it, because one IoT device doesn't look like the next IoT device. Very finally, Alissa, you mentioned regulation. Some of the NIST 2088 standard series, I think, which is out now, and there's lots of iterations of that. The NCSC in the UK deploys them as well, are actually extremely helpful and very good at how do you deal with that knotty problem of something that could be quite a dumb device, but how do you risk assess that, introduce it into an environment, in a zero trust environment, but again, extract from it what you need in a safe and secure way without threat actors being taking advantage of it.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very comprehensive answer. So what is the trade-off between the role of enterprises in terms to protect consumer versus their role themselves? What is the, maybe a question for everybody in the panel, from your experience as you are in very close contact with the consumers? It cannot be only the vendor responsibility, right? But how can we educate the consumer also to take their power share?
You know, I think that's one of the challenges, right? I think bluntly, I think what you have, if you think about a product as having it all being externalities, a consumer, you know, if you're buying a device, you generally don't think about security, right? Sure. Until it affects you, it's not something that occurs to you. So I think one of the things that when you start talking about default mechanisms, default security, that is something to sort of fully embrace, because you want the lowest standard to be still relatively high if you can. So that's one component. I think from an enterprise standpoint, I think the important thing, I think that all of the things that we've been talking about, certainly the things that Mark was just talking about, are the idea of that you can do it as an enterprise. So every device, essentially the idea of zero trust in that model is that you know every device on your network, you know exactly what it's doing, and you control the path both to it and from it. Yeah. Right, and you've put in the controls, you've segmented so that it can't go anywhere else. You've actually employed those standards. And I think that if you start to do that from an enterprise standpoint, it will at least cut down the devices. Even absent regulation, I think that you are starting in the right direction. So that's probably the right place to start.
Great. Maybe.
I mean, I can only compliment that. Let's take the first example. The hardening and ruggedization of the default profile is a responsibility that we have to take. We can't assume that there is expertise out there and everybody's going to be capable to manage the device on their own. Plus, we also need to make it simple for end consumer to be able to deploy and use the device in a very simplistic and secure way. There needs to be simple documentation available for the user to be able to manage this as well. But otherwise, I fully agree. Mark, if you want to comment as well.
Yeah, I mean, Nishant and Alissa, you make some really good points. So there is actually some good news here. There are actually now some real initiatives around how do we get beyond that ghastliness of the stuff that we've seen in the past, of default open passwords and all those sorts of things. So some very basic things which I think industry is now responding to, but we need to continue to push for more regulation there to ensure we have that comprehensively done, which is, you know, for example, things like I mentioned, passwords, but also the ability for devices, if they have the processing power to be running software, for example, because you have to think about this not just from a device, but also from a software point of view as well as a network connectivity point of view. Is there the ability, for example, to make sure that software is up to date? And if known vulnerabilities do exist, can that then be updated, and can those vulnerabilities be addressed and patched? So there are some basic things which actually the list isn't very long. Do those and get those right. Get the manufacturers behind that. And we see some of those initiatives now through some of the well-known bodies that exist in terms of creating standards, that now is coming to pass. And that is not, and again, the challenge there is always, you know, through initiatives like labeling, which I think we'll probably talk about in a minute or two, Carlos, but also it's not just about doing it on a national basis. So how do you do that on a multilat, obviously on a bilat, if appropriate basis as well. And we've seen things now happening on that. So if we can get to a point where we can assume at least that from a given point onwards that you have those basic building blocks in place, then I think that begins to reduce the risk quite substantially. Because again, a lot of these things, it's the power of the of just the sheer scale of IoT that makes it such an attractive target for a threat actor. If you can begin to erode the amount of stuff that's out there that is truly vulnerable, then that goes a long way to start to get on it. So I think, therefore, to answer the question, Carlos, there's a real important piece here from the, as I describe it, pre-market activity through regulation that is going on. But that doesn't negate the need for that post-market activity that I was just talking about. How enterprises now help organizations or enterprises manage those networks in a considered way, just like they have done with the broader category of ECD, enterprise connected devices that have been around forever, laptops and stuff. But applying those same principles, doing the risk assessment work, and then putting the controls in place. So that doesn't negate the need for that, the first part. So I think there's both of those things, but I would say that the ability now for some of those standards to start really coming into play, which aren't particularly onerous when we think about it in security terms, is going to make a big difference.
Thank you very much. And governments are increasingly getting concerned about IoT device security. There has been obviously important hacks, and governments are looking into regulating some of that. We always look at the other sectors, like for instance, before you are able to put a medical product into the market for consumers, you have to go through an FIA regulatory approval. Is that something that is required for IoT? What will be the roles of governments and regulators on that?
I'm in the middle, so I get it.
Yeah,
I think. I think this actually goes back to Mark's point. I think not all devices are the same. I mean, think about it from a medical device standpoint. A medical device could be very well be a kind of IoT device. Clearly, the standards for that are different than the sensor, right? Going back to the analogies that were given before. I think the key when you start to get into the regulatory space is that you don't assume that there is one solution that fits everything. And you really do a sort of, I think you're right, that the NIST standards actually make you do a risk analysis, really put you through thinking about what are you trying to do, what are you trying to accomplish, and how do you go about doing it. And I think that the most positive effect that regulation can have is making sure that that's done. So it's setting the floor, because clearly the default is always going to be an issue. But the default, because security changes so fast, you can't assume that's enough. So that's where it gets into the question of, can you update it, to Mark's point? Is it sophisticated enough for that? Or are there other ways to sort of control access to it? But I think the key from a regulatory framework standpoint and the question of labeling is really making sure it's flexible enough to think about that variation, and making it not just yes, no, good, bad, which I think it's often the sort of tendency of what people think of when they get into the to labeling, frankly.
Yes.
I mean, I think we're all three coming to a very strong, unanimous point. It's not one size fits all. There is a role that regulation plays. There's a role standardization plays. It's been cited. I mean, for example, standardization, HCS standardized, the basic requirements for cybersecurity for consumer Internet of Things. And that actually initiated from UK and CSC as a best practice and then became a standard. Standardization, regulation. And also not just regulation, which is isolated to a country, but it is broader than that. Otherwise, the device proliferation, that stops. We need it to be global standards, global regulation. Finally, we can't take the onus only to the regulator and the standardization bodies. There is an onus on the device owner, the consumer, and then there is onus also on the device producer from a default profiling and the hardening of that, and if possible, upgrading the device as the security requirements go up. So all of that has to happen. We're all agreeing, Mark, if you want to add something.
Well, Nishant, I couldn't agree more on that last point about updating and about, this is where it comes to the labeling point about, labeling is all very well and good to say here it is, but what does that go to and what does that label actually say, and is there something that is onward? But just coming back to the specific point you talk about medical devices, I think one of the things that I see a lot in security is where you get the application of technology in areas like, let's just say, medicine, because you talked about it. The existing regulators have been doing medical device regulation for decades, right? The FDA and the equivalents across all the other countries. They are perfectly capable of assessing risks associated with medical devices, for example, in the context of pure medical. I think the time has come now for security to become less of a very specific thing, and for organizations that are responsible for regulation in those particular industries to continue to up their game, because it's not like they haven't done anything, but to understand that they should be assessing these types of risks in the context of all the other risks that they're assessing all the time. Using the NIST standards to take them through the way to do it, employing the people with the relevant expertise to be able to do that. Because as I think I said before, the deployment, for example, of an IoT device in a medical context is just that, a medical context. So who better to do that than the regulator that is charged with medical devices, as opposed to a regulator that's more of a technical type body that is more better at dealing with standards, but then once it comes to actually the application of it, use the expertise that's already there. The more that we can do that, the better, just because of the ubiquitous nature. And actually why I think that is important is not just because that's where it should be done, it's because actually that will unlock even more benefits. And when we think about medical devices, the benefit of connectivity from IoT devices used in a medical context, we're only just beginning to understand how powerful that could be for a better place for the world overall.
Thank you very much. And what type of differences between categories in IoT devices? Some of them, as you mentioned, medical devices can put threat on your life. Others are more related to trust. A device might be collecting my voice or my data. How you differentiate that in terms of regulatory approach?
Well, okay, I've got the microphone still. So again, it's about the risk. How do you assess the risk? Use the framework to assess the risk, and then the regulation that sits around that either is very specific to that type of device or set of devices, or it might not be that straightforward. It might be much more about has that deployment of that device, because it might be a voice recognition thing, can be used in a myriad of different ways. But has that risk assessment done contextually within how it's being deployed, and then the controls being put around it to create that lowest level, that as zero trust as possible approach, to ensure that when there is any actual use of the device, that it's done in that only the way that is necessary, commensurate with the risk that the environment is deployed in. So I think it's less about getting regulation to fix that, more about getting regulation to create frameworks for people to be able to understand how to make those risk-based decisions and then apply the controls that are appropriate for that context.
And can you mention some agencies then they are doing this properly in terms of best practices?
So I think Mark mentioned NIST before. I completely agree. I think we've all talked about NIST. I think we've talked about, I think what we've seen, the EU has, I agree, we've seen a lot of sort of good development of standards, and I think there has been a lot of progress on that in the last couple of years in particular. I think it's been a really good movement towards it. I think what we haven't seen yet, and I think this is where the EU is moving a little bit more, is a more strict regulatory structure, right? So that is where the Cyber Resilience Act comes into play. Obviously, standards, regulation, they look different. Standards are sort of voluntary measures, and regulation are mandatory. So it will be interesting to watch how that shifts over time.
Yeah. I can make an analogous comment. I mean, I come from the connectivity industry to start with, right? This industry is based on a very important partnership of industry, regulator, and standards. Wireless industry exists globally on common standards, harmonious regulation, and the industry acting in cohort with that. I think it's important all three work together. Yeah. And you're right. I mean, standards will mature, then adherence will come in play. But adherence is also, if the entire industry starts to adhere to it, you can't be the only one not to adhere to it, because then your product's not going to be sold. Yeah. And then finally, if it comes as a pressure from regulation from a Cyber Resiliency Act, okay, then you just have to. But until such time, if the entire industry starts to agree on a standard, it starts to become default. And that's very important. And it has to be a global standard. So ETSI has started, we've talked about NIST, but it has to start becoming universal as well.
Absolutely. And this is an area where WISeKey has been working a lot. But what if there is increasing consensus when it comes to security capability for consumer IoT devices, things like no universal default password, and having a coordinated vulnerability disclosure policy and keeping software updated are reflected on over 100 different standards around the world now. If there is such an agreement, what is going to help manufacture actually implementing these elements with such a diversification?
I'll simply start by saying, if there are 100 standards, it doesn't work. Yeah. I mean, there's not enough intent, money. The standards are diluted if there's 100. that's why I said, I mean, there has to be some kind of global value of that standard. They need to come together, and there needs to be a standard that all can follow, versus, okay, for every geography, we need to pick a standard that we need to adhere to. So I think that activity needs to happen, absolutely.
Yeah, I would add on those in particular. I mean, there's clearly, I think we all agree that there are a set of defaults, right? The baseline of security that where you don't want, where you clearly, and I think all of the things that you just mentioned fit into that category. I think the challenge comes, and I completely agree on one set of standards. I think it's incredibly important, but I think the challenge comes from a device standpoint. When you start to get into that set of standards, it really is the question of devices don't look the same. And so how do you put a set of standards together, which is a risk-based set of standards, then it works. But if you start thinking about it as, hey, individual requirements, that is not going to be the same as a risk-based standard because your devices don't look the same. And so that is the key, I think. And I think we are getting to be much better at that. I think that's actually what the standards development process has been very good at. So hopefully that's where we'll end up.
Well, just to say, as Nishant makes the point, well, actually there are good precursors to where you really have to, CDMA and others, where you know, the ITU and others have created standards, IET over many years that actually do work. So there's good precedent here. Keep the floor, as Alissa says, at the floor. Try not to overcomplicate it. And we've already seen some good bilateral arrangements. You know, Finland, Singapore, I think it is Singapore, UK, others. Yeah. Now really, you know, and that's just a couple of examples. There's many more than that. Really getting into saying, look, let's get that floor right, and then get the. So I'm hopeful that 100 standards thing is going to become hopefully a thing of the past fairly soon, and we'll agree on that floor and get that done at least.
Absolutely. And last year, the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, working with the World Economic Forum, Consumers International, and Ian de Calvary, to produce a joint statement signed by more than 100 organizations from industry, government, and civil society, highlighting the top priority for manufacturers when it comes to the security capabilities for IoT devices. It then launched a resource hub online to support adopting this capability. What more can industry do together to improve IoT device security, and how important is this cooperation with the World Economic Forum for the Tech Accord?
Yeah, I think it is. It's very important. It's a good initiative. Like I was just saying, getting that actually happening on a multilateral basis, making labeling, which we talked a bit about, real, in the sense that it's not just about saying this is what it is, but where can people go to find out more, and how can they understand if there's updates and other things required. So back to that point about the floor, that if a device can be updated, the manufacturer needs to be able to make sure that they're producing those updates, you know, not just at the hardware, but also at the software level as well. So, you know, lots of things that are happening we really welcome, and I think industry can carry on really, and certainly from our point of view, as one of the large IT services, one of the largest in the world, making sure that we push that message into our supply chains, into industry more broadly, that we expect and those standards to be adopted and they manufacture in adherence to them.
I would add, you know, I think WEF is unique in the ability to bring together governments, industry, standards bodies potentially, right? So it's bringing in a lot of the players who you want to be in those conversations on really making sure that we have one set of standards. So you can at least start to shape it. That doesn't mean they're doing the standards development necessarily, but they can push the idea of the security baseline, which is I think what we've seen already. And then they can push the idea of a single standard, because that is where we need to go in the big picture. So I think there's a very important role for WEF, and we're happy they took it on.
I could say, I mean, there is also, it's not easy, it's a tough problem to bring within the industry IT services, security services, system integrators, point solution providers, security solution providers, network providers, system providers on one platform. Because this is not an isolated problem. It's an end-to-end problem that needs to get solved. And of course, there's the standardization and regulator. But all these players within the industry coming together, and that's a huge thing, because then we're truly solving the problem end to end and not isolating it to a particular point.
Thank you very much. The Cybersecurity Tech Accord is going to be the 5th anniversary in 2023. and has a dedicated working group focusing on IoT device security. Maybe for the audience and also for the viewers, what is your experience with the Tech Accord? How the Tech Accord is helping both you inside your organization, but also creating the right consensus around the partners on things that needs to be done and setting priorities?
So what I would say is that, I think the Tech Accord is unusual because it is a group that is just focused on cybersecurity. And so it becomes, it looks a lot different than I would think a sort of trade group or even anything else. I think that idea where you can have a large number of cybersecurity providers of various kinds or companies that have cybersecurity services speaking with one voice is really powerful, and it really says something, I think, from a broader perspective. That's one of the reasons that we've been involved since the beginning.
I agree. I think, simply put, the Accord is a step in the right direction, and it needs to continue. The process of maturization has to happen, which is happening. I mean, the fact that we're all sitting here on a panel and we're all agreeing, I think it's also a platform that exists. We need to this is an industry that we need to collectively create a platform for digitalization on the basis of IoT. WEF, the Tech Accord, regulation, standardization, all of this need to continue to mature because this is not going to get simpler. We've talked about the volume. We've talked about the possibilities in terms of the end consumer and the network attacks that can exist. So a process of maturization needs to continue. It will. And I think we will build a very good platform for future digitalization based on those.
Yeah, I'd just add that the Tech Accord, again, as Alissa was saying, cybersecurity focused. There's one thing about cybersecurity, which I always talk about the characteristics of cyber when you measure up the risk compared to other risks that many enterprises, many of our customers face. Now, large organizations face a whole load of risks all the time. Cybersecurity is often one of those things. Some other risks have this as well. It normally gets done to you. And the velocity, it happens extremely fast. You can go from a state of okay to a state of not okay very quickly, to be simplistic about it. And the thing we particularly like about the Tech Accord is brings together like-minded, same-thinking people where we can move and do things quickly. And that is important to us. We can get that, what's happening outside in, and you can then move quickly without some of the other convoluted things that exist in other areas where you have to go through bodies and this and that. Tech Accord is fast, like-minded. We all have a common interest at play here. One person's threat can be someone else's risk, and getting that information moving quickly through with like-minded people we find really beneficial, so that's why we're so pro.
Thank you very much. Maybe just to give an update, last May we met here and we discussed about the increasing cybersecurity risk at the geopolitical level. Maybe can you give us an update what happened in the last 7 months? There has been obviously very complex and difficult months, but I think for the benefit of the audience it will be good to have an update where we are.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things we talked about last year was Ukraine, and we really talked about the beginning of the conflict in many ways. And I think that what we're seeing now is, the long tail of the conflict. It's still going, and I think, I think one of the narratives that we talked about last time was the fact that there had been a narrative that there had not been significant cyber activity in Ukraine, and that had not been a significant part of the conflict. And I think at the time I rebutted it in some ways by saying that there was cyber activity. It was just, it played a different way than people thought it was going to. It was much more a part of a hybrid conflict. It was not a cyber conflict, which is what I think people were expecting. They were expecting sort of big, splashy cyber attacks, and that was going to be the conflict, and that's not what we saw at all. We saw lower levels, smaller things, sort of intended to disrupt, intended to be problematic, and Ukraine was really good at figuring out how to address them with the help of a lot of companies, right? Frankly, and I think they were really thoughtful and they did a good job in figuring out how to address them. I think that type of conflict has continued, and I think that what we've seen is just really novel uses of networks, and I think that is that there's a future of cyber conflict, or a future of conflict question that involves cyber that is going to look a lot different, and it's going to look a lot more like Ukraine than anything else. So just to give an example, and I can't remember if I brought this up in May or not, maybe it had just happened, so maybe I did, but we've seen rerouting of networks where the idea was you want to employ information controls on, and so networks in Ukraine, as they went into occupied territory, were rerouted through Russia so that they could employ controls on essentially what was accessible. We've seen a lot of different things along those lines where cyber attack has just become part of the fabric of conflict.
Okay. I think I wasn't here in May, but I can say there are two things we haven't talked about today. We haven't used the word metaverse yet in this conversation.
It's going to be a roundtable after.
So we might as well set the precursor for the roundtable about that. But the concept of metaverse, whether it's in the consumer domain, the enterprise domain, or the industrial domain, that concept, starting with digital twinning, is also maturing.
Yeah.
And the underlying fabric for that is sensing and IoT.
Yeah.
And that also starts to create now new vectors and new responsibility from a cybersecurity and IoT security perspective.
Yeah.
So we need to be very aware of that. The second trend, and I wouldn't say it's the last 7 months, it's actually longer than that, but it became prevalent in the last 7 weeks, actually. The use of large language models, the LLMs. Now, those who were not bad actors there, they suddenly start to have access to malware. Somebody didn't know how to write code. They can get access to code. They can simply make a query, give me code that I can use to attack. Those start to exist now. So we need to now be careful as to how that technology also can equip bad actors to get more sophisticated. So I think, like I said, it's a process. We need to make sure we hold the end of keeping things secure very strong. And the technologies like large language models and the opportunities like metaverse will only make that responsibility greater for us.
Yeah, fully agree.
Yeah, I think, Nishant, Alissa, you make some really fantastic points. And just to pick up metaverses, I've just published a thing on, we have in DXC, 5 key trends for 23. Metaverse is one of them. I think, people are sort of thinking, well, is it just headsets and stuff? Not a bit of it. I think as we see tokenization of financial services coming in as well. The use of money in the metaverse is really going to take off, and we can see lots of interesting things happening there. And of course, that comes with that security dividend, negative dividend in the sense that there will be people who will exploit that. But let's not forget that's always balanced against the ability to open up new things, both at an enterprise and a consumer level as well. So it's always that risk equation that we have to manage, but undoubtedly new risks coming from there that we're going to have to be very mindful of. But I just want to come back to the situation around the conflict. I think what has really struck me about it has been, as Alissa says, it hasn't really panned out perhaps as it was previously thought of, but it's that combination of partnership at often quite a low level that has been incredibly impactful. And it's an ongoing situation, ongoing defense is happening all day, every day, and those partnerships and that way in which the need to be able to react quickly through those partnerships I was talking about earlier on has really shown that is now potentially I don't want to quite use the word, but a way of working, almost a doctrine that we're going to see emerging for the future, which is obviously very different from traditional military conflict type of thinking. I think it's been incredibly enlightening, quite very successful, but we're going to have to really learn from that, embrace it, and recognize the fact that a lot of what has happened because people have come together quickly because they've known people in networks to be able to defeat some of the risks that have been out there and turn that into the ability for that hybrid type of environment to continue without the potentially the sensationalist type of things that were headlined a few months ago. So it's been a lot more successful, I think, than many of us thought, and a very new way of doing things, which we need to reinforce, I think.
And I think it has also reinforced the mission statement of the Tech Accord itself, right? Of cooperation towards a joint objective, which in this particular case is very clear, the objective. Yeah. So we have 50 minutes. I don't know if there's any question from the audience that you would like to, yeah, please. Maybe if you don't mind to introduce yourself.
Yeah, of course. I'm Alonso. I'm Alonso, I'm from Cloudflare. We started the conversation talking about regulations, about standards. Those things take time. For the people who are listening via video and here in the room, what are some things that they can do, tomorrow when they talk to their organizations, their CIOs, their CTOs, to protect their organizations and IoT in particular? And what could consumers do tomorrow to go protect themselves?
Want to take that?
Yeah, so if it's a CIO that's being spoken to or whatever, so number one, I think I said earlier on, conduct a risk assessment in terms of the type of IoT devices, what characteristics do they have, what can actually be done on those devices. That will then immediately take you down a route of the types of controls that you need to have in place. At the most basic level, make sure that those basic floor controls are in place around access, authentication, passwords, things like that. If there is some processing power and human interface available, then there is necessarily a need in an organization to create some form of a control point. If there is central control available, so then the updates and the like can be pushed to it. Create network compartmentalization that can then allow those devices to run in a way in which that can be controlled, and then monitor the traffic in those networks to then be able to then take that into the threat intel and the monitoring that organization has to then be able to then respond if they see something odd happening in the environment. So through compartmentalization and control, at a very generic way, that's what I would be advising. Of course, it's got to be very specific to the types of devices and how they're deployed. As far as the consumer side is concerned, I think we said those floor controls, consumers are becoming more aware of it, but making sure that they are in place through the standards that are beginning to take hold. I think, so those are the two sides. But from an enterprise point of view, risk assess it, create the inventory, create the controls, use the products like, for example, Alyssa's talked about that Cloudflare has, to limit the access. I always say, go down to that zero trust approach, keep the trust as absolutely as locked down as possible, trust as little as possible. That will then hopefully really protect the organization in the first place. It's where you have wide open access that the problems really start.
Thank you very much. Any other question? Yeah, please.
Thank you. My name is Sandra. I'm a behavior scientist. And one thing I can tell you about users is that they generally don't update their password or any kind of security thing until you really, really push them. So my question is, can the industry create an environment in which you essentially nudge a typical user who is not be doing all the updates that they should? They're not going to read on that, even if they have to, but they usually don't. So can you nudge the user by the technology so that they actually don't make typical mistakes in which they would expose themselves to any kind of risk? And then maybe a follow-up question, if you could make it a standard so that it's even like a smart standard, so it's kind of self-updates, because the technology is developing faster than a typical user can follow up on that. So, yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Do you want to? I think we'll both have one.
The answer is yes and yes.
So I think on the nudge piece, I think the thing that's the most important is actually thinking about how you do everything you can by default. I think this gets back to that base piece. So you don't want the user to have to do anything. So you don't even want the nudge. You want as much built in from an automated standpoint as possible. That's automated updates. That's all of those things that can happen without a user having to do things for exactly the reason that you just mentioned. On the nudge side, though, I think there are amazing things these days. I mean, even from a work perspective, just updating software at work, we have software that is literally a nudge. It's a reminder that you have an obligation to update your software, and it comes and pops up, and there's an obligation. I think there's similar things that can be done on the device side, but I do think when you start getting into the consumer space, people ignore them. I mean, everyone in this room has actually gone through and just ignored nudges before. So really starting to think about security by default, imposing that from the baseline, and then doing automated updates if you're doing updates, thinking about systems that you can create that look like, that will do things for the consumer. Those are all the areas that we should be going to. One other just quick point, I think even from a consumer standpoint, I think people don't realize how easy it is to actually see what's connected on your network. There are ways of doing that. It's not actually that hard even for consumers. What we haven't done is do a good job educating, making people think about it. And I think there's more work that can be done there.
I can only agree. I think the first line of defense is not to depend on the consumer or the user to be savvy, because that's a point of failure in itself. Then, of course, in certain critical devices cases, you can actually not just nudge, you can mandate a secondary reset. And it can be periodic, or it can be based on some other point of inflection that the user has to reset their password. It happens today, and we can absolutely. The question of standardizing those is more based on the use, and it's more based on the application rather than a generic horizontal standard as much. On the enterprise side, where, of course, if we keep the starting point as zero trust, now we know that there is certain vulnerable user out there, and there's a policy of password update, but that gets ignored. There is also a possibility for that CIO to use access control mechanisms and downgrade that user. Say, you don't have the same access because you're now creating a problem for the entire network. So there is a possibility of downgrading the access control as well. So those mechanisms do exist.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Yes, gentleman there, please.
I actually have a somewhat, I'm from Nokia as well. I have a follow-up question to hers, and that borderlines the point where security and privacy meets probably, and the point raised was, we need minimum nudge to the user. Case in point, as we are here, I get an email which says, which cloud security vendor is right for you? Probably by one of your competitor. So, which is the point where less nudge to users from a security point of view is not sort of breaching privacy rights of users? What's your thought?
So question being, not by nudging users, that's a privacy issue, is what you're saying. Yeah, well, I think, I don't see it as a necessary privacy issue, but I mean, the broader question around privacy security is a good one. Just because something's secure doesn't mean that it's necessarily you're respecting the privacy obligations that exist through many regulations that we know about. So that's something that I often say to organizations when talking to them. Yeah, the privacy risk is there are controls within the security environment that help with the privacy risk, but it's not the whole thing. I think the question that you're saying about is nudging users to be able to move software along or doing that something which is potentially a privacy issue. I don't necessarily see it that way. We all sign up to the end user agreements. When it comes to software agreements, I can't say I'm the person who's read all of them. I don't know if anyone has in this room, but I'm sure there's something in there about that the organization has the ability to be able to do that. But I want to come back, though, to the broader point, which is Nishant talked about, what we talk about in the industry, very specifically around conditional access now as being one of those things. And Alissa as well talked about the fact that there's so much that we can do now without having to do that nudging, with it just happening. So actually, the real solution to that thing, the problem that you outlined, that privacy security piece is, don't actually have the privacy piece in there. Just make sure that happens automatically in any case. Then you don't have to even go to the user in the first place and involve them, as long as you're making it clear from the outset that actually that is something that, as a software vendor, you are going to do, and that the user agrees that you can do, because obviously that is important, that agreement is there in the first place. But that's the much better way, as opposed to actually even having to interact with the user in the first place to get those updates done, which creates that standard flaw, as we've talked a bit about over the last few minutes.
No, I agree with all that. I think the other thing that I would say, I think one of the things that we're seeing right now, there is a question even from a cloud vendor, right? Where do you start? So do you have to turn the things on, or do you have to turn them off? And you may want to be able to configure, and it's certainly reasonable to be able to configure the way you want to. But if you can start from a place where the security controls are on and you have to turn them off, that is generally a better place for most users, right? So you don't want an open bucket, right? Not that I'm. I think it's really important to think about those as the defaults in the controls, and just think about the role that defaults play, frankly, for exactly that reason.
So, Alissa, Nishant, Mark, thank you very much again for educating us and updating us on very important subjects. I think, again, as I say, TechAccord is a great ecosystem where we can learn a lot and where we can also act a lot. And I look forward to continue seeing you in future editions. Maybe as we're moving now to the Metaverse roundtable, just maybe if you can just join me to give a great wrap to the team. Well done. Thank you very much for all your help.
That was great.
Really good. Thanks, Nishant.
Thank you very much. digest so many different things. But this panel is something that I think is going to be the highlight of the day, as we are covering a very important subject, which is the metaverse. So this panel is going to be co-host with my partner and business partner and also book partner, David Ferguson. And we would like just to invite the speakers, if you can join us here, and we will start. This room is going to get very busy in 40 minutes, as we will have open bar. So get good places before that get very, very busy.
I have you at the end.
No, I'm not the speaker.
Well, welcome everybody. It's only Wednesday, but it feels like Friday, and I know this day, like the two before it, have been busy for everyone. I think the title for tonight's session is particularly appropriate, and as I'm sure many of you recognize, I should hold the microphone closer. I'm sure many of you recognize the reference to CERN, the home of the World Wide Web, in the theme of tonight's session, Geneva 3.0. Geneva is also home to many of the world's leading humanitarian initiatives, and I think it's only fitting that one of the leading technology companies there, WISeKey, born in Geneva, has the security, equality, and advancement of humanity at its core. And it's the vision of WISeKey founder Carlos Moreira that Geneva play a pivotal role in the establishment of a trusted global protocol for the humanity-technology relationship in Web 3.0. And this event represents the formal introduction of that mission to the public. And as a Davos pioneer, I can't think of a better place for Carlos to introduce this initiative. Carlos, would you like to say a couple of words about that?
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for the panelists and the panel and for the audience. So as David mentioned, the subject of this year in the World Economic Forum is to build partnerships. And as you maybe witnessed in the previous roundtable with the Tech Accord, it is essential that partnership happens. And when we say partnership, it can not only be driven by revenue or business. It's actually solving the complex projects and the complex things that the society is facing. We are in a complex world that is getting more complex on daily basis. So one of the meeting points of that complexity is the metaverse. In all the meetings we had this week and continue having, there is, even on the meeting we just had on the roundtable before, there is a consensus that the metaverse could become the glue that brings all these technologies in a real environment, an environment where we can see results. And in that line of thought, we obviously position Geneva, because Geneva is not only the home of WISeKey. We started in Geneva. I also worked in the United Nations in Geneva for many years. But it's also the place where the World Wide Web was invented, which is Web 1.0. And now everybody's talking about Web 3.0. And obviously, Geneva has an important role in that evolution of the web. As Web 2.0 created some complexities in what concerns privacy, the way some companies have been using our data, the way our identities have become out of our control. So there is a remedy that the metaverse, the Web 3.0 could facilitate. And this is going to be the subject of today, and I give you back to you to moderate, because I think if we can come in with some kind of concrete architecture on this Web 3.0 with a neutral trust model, which is the one that Switzerland has been advocating, we will have already a very important milestone achieved. I pass you.
Thank you, Carlos. And I think, as you all know, trust was at the root of an initiative that was born here. It was conceived here following a conversation between Carlos and I and Tim Berners-Lee in 2018. And we were very proud, after workshopping the concept further here at Davos, to be able to introduce the Transhuman Code in 2020. The world changed, of course, rather dramatically following that introduction, but interestingly, that relationship between humanity and technology has stayed at the forefront. And it's formed many of the dialogues that we've been having over the last couple of days. And I know our panel members that are assembled here tonight will be pleased to share their insight and perspective on where we are and where we're going as we move into 3.0. The distributed to you when you came in this evening was a copy of our progress report. It's a glimpse into what's to come later this spring as we revisit each of the 12 elements of our life ecosystem and how humanity and technology are advancing, and how trust can be best established, and how the human can be best served. We'd like to invite all of you to contribute to this next chapter in the Transhuman Code, and so we invite you, perhaps WISeKey people that are here in the room, if you can raise your hands. If you're interested to contribute to the next generation of the Transhuman Code, the progress report, please reach out to any of the WISeKey staff that are here tonight, and it would be our pleasure to engage with you. But now let me introduce you to our esteemed panelists. Each of these individuals has been a participant and a contributor in Web 1.0 and 2.0, and so we think it's only fitting that they share those experiences and also give us a glimpse into what they're working on and what their outlook is for Web 3.0. Our first speaker this evening, Pierre Maudet. Pierre is the Chief Digital Transformation Officer at WISeKey, and I'll ask you a little later to share your background leading into this role, of course, and where you're going next. Daniel Karemi, many of you would recognize as the former head of technology for the World Economic Forum. Daniel is here as the co-founder of the Edgewoods Institute, actively advising, and I know you'll share more detail with us, organizations, corporations, and governments around the world today on Web 3.0. Mauricio Benavides from Metabase is here tonight from Mexico, a pioneer in cybersecurity and now actively focused on where and how we're going to engage and protect ourselves in the metaverse. Hossein Ranama, I'm sure many of you would recognize from his work here at the WEF in the past, the CEO of Flybits, a pioneer in fintech, as well as an active guide and educator both with MIT and Toronto Metropolitan University. And last but not least, Murat Sinitopozov, the chairman of the Integral Group, a Davos veteran, and of course a Geneva veteran who's been witness to that convergence and the need to ensure that, that humanity, capitalism, and technology are all aligned. Pierre, let's start with you.
Pleasure. Thanks, David. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your words, David. It's a great pleasure for me to answer to your question. The question is, what is the next issue with Web 3.0, especially in Geneva? As Carlos mentioned, the title of the WEF this year is Cooperation in a Fragmented World. And I think that's the issue. I heard in many conferences today and yesterday, is to put together a lot of data and a lot of systems, and to put that together with standards, with rules. And I think that Geneva, as former mayor of Geneva especially, Geneva could be the place with the history, with the CERN, with the invention of the web, where humanity meets technology. The place where we can put together these two issues, where we can answer to the question not only where, but who. Who, that means in the Web 3.0, not only the GAFAM, but also the citizens, the human people who are involved in the human rights, with the environmental issues. All these questions are discussed in Geneva, and I think this issue could be discussed in this seat. That is my point to start the discussion.
I am not from Geneva, but I couldn't agree more with Pierre, what just said. And if you think about it, why is such a unique place? Ever since John Calvin picked that place to redefine the protocols of human interaction, and way back before technology was even the thing, he put it on the church door right there in Geneva, which was later facilitated by the printing press and so on. So Geneva has a tradition of challenging the assumptions, making things happen, but in a way that is also quite unique manifestation at an international level of what the unique Swiss style of governance is, which is consensus building, changing of the, even the presidency changes. So it's like it's the same way of governance, but at international level on steroids. Now, everybody forgets that, yes, internet was born in California, but the web was born in Geneva. And although the title is Web 3.3, I actually truly believe that right now we're still at Internet 3.0. We are not yet at Web 3.0, because what we're seeing emergence of tech, we're seeing emergence of applications. And truly, it's when the pages will start talking to each other, interoperability, trust, that's when Web 3.0 will be born. Right now, we're still in Californian stage, but we're moving very quickly, hopefully on the Swiss air, to Geneva. Thank you.
Take us even further south of the border, Mauricio.
Yeah, no, thank you for the invitation, and I couldn't echo more than this. I think one of the things that we experience is there's no boundaries in this type of things. There's no frontiers. Once you start going into the web and you start going into places like that, there's no boundaries anywhere. So I think the way we look at it is we always see what's going on in Geneva to see how regulation is impacting, because then after you put the regulation in place, you need to make sure that you execute it, no? Because you could have everything as to how it should be done, but one of the most important things is how it's being applied in the world. And when we look at it from a cybersecurity perspective, it's very interesting because we keep seeing and hearing that the attacks continue to go, they keep growing, they keep understanding that we keep getting more connected to the internet. And obviously from our perspective, we need to make sure that that world is also super connected. So that's why we believe that being here in Geneva, understanding where those policies, where Web 3.0 is going, et cetera, makes a huge importance with the different regions, areas around the world. And again, since there's no boundaries when you're there, there's no frontiers, there's nothing, we need to make sure that that execution is taking place properly and people are well informed. So,
thank you, Mauricio.
One of our key interest areas, especially at Flybits, is to really understand how this new internet, a lot of us call it Web 3.0, the internet of value, the new internet, can look like. And one aspect that we are very interested in is that whether the channel is going to be metaverse or immersive experiences, we think that it's a perfect fabric to bring a lot of industries together to collaborate. Up until now, even if you look at the enterprise internet, it's pretty verticalized. Oh, I need a CRM in the finance industry, or I need it for healthcare, or I need it for insurance. One of the key areas that we are seeing, especially because of the physics of data, is that all of them are converging. And Metaverse has a fantastic power to bring them together. So one of the key initiatives that we have called the Open Dome, that you will see a demo of that today, is to bring financial institutions, healthcare organizations, insurance companies, travel companies all together, and based on the permission and consent of the data will be rendered in such immersive experiences based on the need of the user. So if you think about Web 1.0, which was all about content, first you had to code your HTML pages, then you had web authoring tools. And now we are building the same set of tools for any organization to be able to build these data-driven predictive services in immersive environments, while the data is not co-located. Because we are all interested in how great Metaverse looks like, but we are not really talking about, well, how do we render such great information? Do we still expect everyone to co-locate their data into one centralized data lake? I really don't think that's going to happen. So a lot of the protocols that we are working on is that how do we allow different organizations to ask questions from each other's data, and based on the permission of the user, create these next generation experiences for their end users. And we will share a video with you later today so that you can get some ideas on how it can look like.
Thank you, Hussein.
Several comments from my side. I'm in the business, real commodity trading, physical commodity trading. And why it's important for us, Web 3.0, and then I will come also to Geneva and Geneva role in it. Several years ago, we started a new project, which we called Electronic Trader, which could allow computer or artificial intelligence to trade physical commodities. But in order to do this, we needed to collect various fragmented data from various sources on the price, on the logistics, on the conditions, and so on and so on. And after a couple of years of exercise, we didn't manage. We understood that data is so fragmented, and for that, our system cannot understand all of these formats, all of this data. And here I think Web 3.0, there's a good opportunity with the semantic web where all this data could be somehow translated into the common format. And now about Geneva. We have several problems now, and one of the problems is that looks like today the tendency is that internet or web could be splitted or separated by several blocks because of the regulations. Let's say American block, European Union block, Chinese block, Russian block, and we can continue. Even some countries went further. They created some kind of internal internet called intranet. Daniel knows the story. No, several countries did this. And at the end, there is no mechanism how to introduce the regulations into the internet on the global level. And here Geneva, with the vast experience with United Nations technology agencies, with good professional companies like WISeKey and a lot of others, really could play a role to bring the standards and regulations. And the one small comment, a little bit negative on the metaverse. I think for metaverse, although I hate to talk about regulations, especially in the digital side, but there is a big probability that some part of our population will migrate from our difficult, problematic reality with the never-ending crises into the beautiful virtual world of metaverse. And we need to deal with this, and we need also to regulate. Thank you.
Thank you, Murat. Pierre, I think you would agree that Geneva has permission. Daniel has very eloquently shared the history of Geneva, how you've come to be where you are today. What does that process look like, do you think, to talk to Murat's point of how and could the world allow Geneva to really set the standards for Web 3.0?
Very good question. I definitely agree with this consensual position, but the right question is how. How to go in this direction. That's that's right, that the term convergence, the merge between the data are very central. But also I have to give another argument, maybe a little bit paradoxal, but a typical Swiss argument. We are focused on a decentralized system, and that is very important also in the direction of a Web 3.0 oriented on the citizens. I mean, the solution of a big centralization is not a solution, and that is in the Swiss DNA to understand that. And maybe to answer to your question, the right way to go in this direction is to focus on the basis on the human rights, on the rights on the. You spoke about the fact that the people have to agree with the data transfer, with the data ownership. And I think we have to discuss first in Geneva, in this human rights city, about the rights in the Web 3.0, the rights of the citizen. That is maybe the start point to develop the question to how go in this direction.
Thank you. Daniel, Web 2.0 was in its raw infancy, I think, when you accepted the challenge from the World Economic Forum to bring technology into the dialogue. I know that's the origin of your relationship with Carlos. Since that, we've seen the emergence of, the explosion of, in some cases, the implosion of the platforms that have wreaked havoc in the minds of those that want to ensure that the human is at the center of gravity with technology. What does it look like today for you?
Well, and you actually hitting the question right there where I wanted to go, so thank you for pitching it without us coordinating, just to be clear. But I think that's where Geneva is also extremely well positioned, because Geneva always takes a very interesting approach, which is forward and optimistic looking with the full awareness of all the risks that come along with it. Do you know that the genre of artificial intelligence taking over the world was actually born in Geneva? So Frankenstein as an idea was conceived in a beautiful mansion just outside of Cologne, and we all know where that went, and that is just explosion of the genre, right? It was the first artificial intelligence, if you will. But the beauty of it, of course, in all seriousness, is that Geneva has a long tradition of making sure that something that is difficult and what is thought under as a purview of states or other actors that are powerful on the international stage, taking it away, making sure that the systems talk to each other and are human-centric. Let me give you an example. The very first international organization, period, is not the United Nations, it's the universal one, but the first one was International Postal Union, which is still headquartered in Bern. And it was all about interconnection of system. You had a postal system in your country that needed to connect with the postal system in the other country. Interconnection at its best. The other thing, when the genius of in Geneva said, look, the wars will always be there. The powers will fight. But how can we make it human-centric and create the whole field of humanitarian law? That's also Geneva right there for you. So, you know, I know that you were hoping for a future-focused panel, but in order for us to go into the future, we have to understand the past.
Indeed. Mauricio, I know you're spending time across the globe. You're headquartered in Mexico, but of course the applications of your work are felt from corner to corner. What observations can you make? Perhaps you have an opinion on Geneva and its future role. I'm also interested to know, are you seeing significant variances in terms of how the human will remain significant, relevant in technological advancement from market to market?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time on the technology aspect in San Francisco, so that also brings a really interesting component, no? I mean, today we're talking about the guy that started building flying cars, no? There's a bunch of companies where you start integrating chips into people, no? Very, very interesting aspects. So I think what I've seen in the last couple of days here in Davos is a lot of conversations, a lot of people with different ideas. I think the terms are still to be defined because you have different positions. And I think that's why being here makes it super interesting, because it's about dialogue, it's about collaboration, and it's about understanding on what makes sense as the world moves into something like that. No? So it's interesting because depending on what type of panels you go into or who do you talk to and what industries they're in, they have a completely different view or a different view of exactly what they're thinking that the future is going to look like. But I think these type of conversations in the short term are needed, so that way, as a collaboration entity in Geneva, because the experience and the long term, you know, at the end of the day, there's like a common point, because at the end of the day, to make it scalable, it has to be common. No? And I love what Jose is saying is, you know, a lot of things get combined, and for that to happen, you know, there has to be some common grounds at some point to make sure that everybody's moving towards the same direction. Because if not, I mean, you start bringing the virtual reality aspect, and you start bringing all different terms, and whether it's the industry, not the industry, how do you bring all those pieces together? So I think that dialogue is happening now. It's super interesting, and I think there's a central point, which is Geneva, to make sure that those conversations happen and it gets more aligned, no?
Hussein, I think you would agree that there's more conversation during these last couple of days about that relationship between humanity and technology, particularly as it pertains to AI and how we're going to use the metaverse in particular. I think in addition to your commercial business focus, I referenced your work at MIT and what was Ryerson, now Toronto Metropolitan University. What I didn't share, however, is that Hussein is the co-founder of what is consistently ranked for, I don't know, 16, 18 years to date, the #1 business accelerator and incubator in the world. And I know that when you come here, not only do you come to share wisdom, but you also come to glean wisdom and bring that back to students and those that you're encouraging to innovate. So I'm curious to hear just some of your key takeaways from the last couple of days.
Thanks, Dave. I think one thing that is at least interesting for our group is that symbiosis between the real world, us, and the new internet. If you look at a lot of the new metaverse activities, it tries to completely lock down in a virtual world which has nothing to do with what we experience in the real world. The interesting thing is, and the set of protocols and the algorithmics that are needed is, how do we bring these two together? Examples that some of our students are working on. If you expect your children and kids to spend a lot of time on worlds like Worlds of Warcraft and Roadblocks, well, tie it back to their Fitbit. If they are not exercising or not moving, right, deactivate things, right? Think about a bank in a metaverse, right? Go to a retail store, not necessarily do online shopping, but what you buy in that real store, and when you develop relationships, those signals will find their way into the virtual world, really creating that nice fabric of symbiosis between the real world and the virtual world. The other thing that you mentioned is also very important, which is the other way around. When I work with our students, the mindset of a graduate student in a research lab or a Web3 class is, okay, professor, give me the data and I'll do my project, or I will write my thesis. Unfortunately, that mindset does not work in the real world. How many entrepreneurs and founders we see that they're like, I have this amazing AI capability, but no one gives me the data. Well, of course, no one should give you the data, because we need now portability protocols that without moving the data, we now gain the ability to ask questions from the data. This is where zero-knowledge proofs comes into action, homomorphic encryption, ability to agree on policies rather than data moving. And I think by creating literacy around that, we now have a next generation of entrepreneurs and researchers that are building the right set of tools for the future of the internet, worrying less about the complexity of IT and algorithms, but more about the creative outcomes, what we now call creative AI, that really allows us to address key pain points that we are facing in this fragmented world.
You're right, I can't think of a better way to segue into this ongoing discussion that I know Hussein wants to have with you about the metaverse than perhaps to show a video of what you're doing with Flybits. Can we cue that?
So the video that you're about to see is an initiative that my team built at Flybits called the Open Dome. We don't call it a metaverse or anything to do with meta. It's a dome that can render open and public data. So we are now working with large financial institutions, large telecom carriers, large insurance providers, and really allowing users to render their information in a decision space. And then we use AI without centralizing the data to really tell the users, well, what is the relationship between your assets versus when you want to retire versus how you can pay your mortgage faster. And I allow you to use the metaverse to plan your life better. I'm not sure if it's playing.
Are we ready to go, Michael?
Yeah.
Do we have sound?
Yep. Yep. So
Okay,
these are examples, again, based on a few fundamentals. The new metaverse cannot have data centralized in silos. The new metaverse should understand different data contracts. Some of this data belongs not to the company, but to users. Some of this data is public. Some of this data is proprietary. Let's build tools that we take care of that complexity, and through creating transparency, auditability, we can now allow people to build these experiences. The second thing that is important in Open Dome is we actually don't believe the hardware is ready for mainstream metaverse adoption. So we are now building omni-channel capabilities that you can render the same metaverse on your phone, on a web browser, and if you want to wear a headset, you can do that. We are working with banks now. We are doing LiDAR scanning of real branches, that if you want to meet with your real financial advisor, you go there, you see all your portfolio, but you can have a Zoom conversation with a real person in the metaverse. So bringing these two worlds are very, very important to us. Then we are applying AI on this fabric. Like if you bring your data from your airline, your grocery store, your telecom carrier? Do we understand the context and the ontologies of that data, allowing you to personalize your metaverse for what's relevant to you? There's a view about the metaverse that, oh, who's going to win that race? Well, maybe there is a view on that. I actually think every single user should have the ability and authority to create their own personalized metaverse, collecting and aggregating and synthesizing their data, and then bring AI capabilities to understand the relevance of that. If you know about my insurance policy, if you know about my spending habits, if you even have access to some clinical data, which is very sensitive, but I can have it encrypted on my local chipset, through tokens, I can truly understand the relationships and help you to come to this personalized metaverse and interact with it without worrying about making it too collaborative and too social. Last thing I say is, this by no means what other entities are doing, like Meta and others, are wrong. That's a different type of a metaverse to look at, which is more about collaboration and learning and marketing. This is a different view that I had, and I wanted to share it with our friends here.
So I think rather than setting you up for a debate, Murad, I thought you should hear a perspective on the metaverse that's real, because you have multiple banks around the world now engaging with you, and it's all focused on not only the establishment of your content and your resources, but your ability to be able to pack them and travel with them to wherever you think you should go.
Yes.
That's exactly the response we were hoping for. No, we're at such an early inflection point at this time. And what's encouraging, and Carlos, I know you'd like to speak more to this evening, is that trust is at the center of it, and the desire to ensure that it's human first. And that wasn't the conversation that was happening across the WEF 3 years ago.
No, metaverse is the future, definitely, and that's why I think Facebook was renamed to Meta at certain stage. They understood this, and we should be ready for that future. And to be ready for something unknown, we should try to predict what could happen, to check the possible outcomes, possible problems, and we need to deal with these problems. And again, back to the regulations, and I think metaverse is exactly the application for the proper regulations. Because it could be very dangerous, it could be very useful, it could be very nice, it could be very bad. It depends how you will structure this. And here again, back to Geneva, I think Geneva could play a really important role in that. Because I don't see any other place in the world which could be neutral, having great reputation, having great capabilities. Like in Geneva, we have all possible communities, starting from the traders communities, finance communities, insurance communities. Then we are going to the international organization communities, United Nations, and even World Economic Forum is in Geneva at the end. And we have cybersecurity community, we have now metaverse community, and everything is available. Just we need also to stimulate all these guys to talk between each other and come with the proper solutions, with the proposals. And then because of the reputation of the international reputation of Geneva, I think it will be doable to establish or position Geneva like as one or possibly the main important center for the internet regulation for the world. And I think this is the real task, and I think Geneva should really work on this together with the Swiss government and the Swiss government institutions. And with all of us together, and starting from WISeKey, from Carlos with his great ideas. Thank you.
Well, this panel, I think, is very thoughtfully is curated by Carlos, bookended by a corporate leader based in Geneva, a former and continually aspiring government leader here in Pierre. Pierre, would you like to respond?
Yes, maybe another argument that appears very clearly to me after the little film. I think a challenge in the Web 3.0 is the convergence between the private sector and the public sector. And definitely the ability to work together, but also to increase, for example, the standards. I give you two examples. ISO, which is a private company, but very important for the world, and ITU, with a new boss since the beginning of January, have to work together to ensure the development of the web, and that could only happen in Geneva. The fact that private and public sector have to work together, but we have to wake up. Honestly, I think neutrality is very important, but we have to stay neutral, maybe at first, and it's maybe a message to the Swiss government to give the condition to have trust, merge between private and public, and good standard focused on the human rights. I think we have all the ingredients to make something very, very interesting, but we have to do it.
I think
we will try to do it with WISeKey.
Thank you. Perfect closing remarks. As we come up on time, Daniel, what would you like to leave us with?
Well, I think it's, if you hear Web 3.0, what do you think about it? It's evolution, right? It's evolution from Web 0.0 and when it comes to metaverse, we're still all reptiles, because if you think about it, what do people do in Roblox? Change skins, right? So as evolution progresses, soon we will be mammals, and then we will become truly human-centered metaverse beings.
Well, I think it's a very interesting topic that we should be putting a lot of attention to, because I think long-term, on a human perspective, is going to have a big impact. No? However we started today is going to have how the world is going to be acting, performing, executing in many, many years after. No? So I think it's critical to make sure that all this is planned, done properly, and that we're paying attention to make sure that, you know, over the years we're doing the right things to make the world better. No?
Yeah, I think on my side, I'm less worried about the technological aspect of it, but more focused on the ethical aspect of it, and especially on the literacy side of things. That how do we really have a new generation that are well trained on what data means, what is privacy, how do I share my data, how do I benefit from these amazing digital channels. And my interest is to do that very early on, like start having children's books on privacy and data sharing rather than waiting until they are teenagers. And I think if we can really help with those literacy programs from K-12 while technology is being implemented and adopted, that convergence between our human capital and technological capital will really allow us to build a great ecosystem.
Thank you, Hussein.
Just 3 words: cooperation, cooperation, and cooperation. And thank you, Carlos, for initiating these discussions.
Carlos?
And even he did the almost impossible thing. Daniel was planned to mention this. I will mention. Yeah, he brought 2 speakers from Turkmenistan to the same panel in Davos.
That may be a first.
Yeah, and from our side, hope we will do something together also during the Caspian Week next January here in Davos. We'll plan something good. Yes, thank you.
So yeah, I say, but back to your point, Facebook is Meta and Geneva is the verse, right? The metaverse, being a virtual space, requires gates. You have to bring the physical world to the virtual world. And those gates are being constructed around the world. So you have Singapore. I was in Seychelles with the Prime Minister, where WISeKey has done a project for the first island on the metaverse. WISeKey have delivered that project. And I can see the international trend where cities are becoming more and more focused in becoming a gate. Why a gate? It's like in a highway, you need a gate to access to the main road. And those gates needs to be authenticated gates, needs to be gates where you're gonna have, as Pierre say, standardization, where interoperability is gonna be required by international organizations, and they are still very much in the analog world. I mean, if you visit all these organizations in Geneva and you have one-to-one discussions with them, you immediately realize that they are still thinking as an analog organization. They do standards, but those standards are done in an analog way. They don't necessarily understand the final destination of those standards. So I think the molecularization of that process, meaning studying where are the best practices around the world and extract, rather than calling ITU or WIPO or WHO, call best practices. What do you have in your organization that molecularize can be integrated in a bigger body, which is the metaverse that we are building. And it has to be driven by many sectors. Today here, and that has been my focus is to give a glance of where a small company like WISeKey is doing in the space sector, in the NFT sector with WiseArt, in the metaverse sector, in the cybersecurity sector with the TechAccord Roundtable, which is actually one of the leading think tanks now in cybersecurity, used by the World Economic Forum to trial new cybersecurity models. So this cooperation is starting to happen, and we are very happy that this room here, I was congratulating the director of this hotel because I mentioned to him the first time I came here, I was a startup. And actually now I am on the NASDAQ, so that progression happened in that room every year. We have become year after year while Pierre was minister. And we have been briefing the community about the advances of technology. And in many areas, we have been thought leaders. So now the thought leadership process is cooperation. And I fully endorse the vision of partnership of the World Economic Forum. We are here to help. We are here to bring our piece of experience in our side and bring this network of people like Murat. I mean, Murat is trying to do something that has never been done before, which is creating an ecosystem in the Caspian region. This is a complex region of the world that requires a lot of effort. And he has done an amazing work by becoming a thought leader here in Davos on his Caspian Week. So this is the invitation to everybody in this panel, in this room, and following us online, is that let's build a collaboration model which will not be based on revenue or making money. It should be based on creating really a better state of the world, because we are in that inflation point that if we don't find solutions now, including sustainability solutions, we're going to be in danger. So I'd just like to thank you for your moderation, thanks the panel, and thank everybody. Again, that has been a heavy day. We started at 3, and there has been so many great ideas, and we love to continue doing the same thing next year and make it bigger and bigger. Thank you for your moderation too.
He worked, but you have